Alright, so I'm going to be telling you guys about the history of Tanzania. As this title page suggests, there are two parts to this. Part one will only be talking about the history, and part two will be covering a much more in-depth discussion about certain parts, particularly from periods after 1990. This one ends at 1990, but starts all the way back in the ancient world. So we got about 4,000 years of history to cover in 6 to 8 minutes. So we're going to try to go really quick. But before we really get into the history, we have to talk and tell you where Tanzania is. Tanzania is in Africa. It is right here. As soon as I pull it up. Right there. There are some important key geographical things you need to keep in mind. One is that it borders 3 Great Lakes. That is super important for trade, and we'll kind of get into that in just a minute. Not only does it border those 3 Great Lakes, but it also has several larger lakes within its borders. Tanzania is actually 2 provinces. One is the province of Zanzibar, which is a chain of islands, and then the other is the Tanganyika territory, which actually didn't get its name until 1920 when the Germans lost World War I, and we'll talk about it. So it also, as you can tell, borders several nations, several of those being Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Zambia, and Mozambique. And then those are actually countries we're going to be talking about more in the second part, where we talk about the refugee crisis that they faced in the 90s. So now we're going to do a quick look at the past. As I said, we got like 4,000 years of history to cover, so we're going to break it up into 3 quick and easy parts. One of those is going to be the pre-European influence, which is going to cover all the ancient world up until about 1400 something. And then we've got the European influence, which covers 1400 to the 20th century. And then from 1960 to 1990 is the post-European influence. Post-European is in quotes for part 2. So, getting into the pre-European influence part, this region was well known in the ancient world for its trade. Ptolemy, in his book Geography, wrote about it. In particular, he wrote about a city known as Rapta, which was controlled by a political entity known as Tanzania. To this day, we actually don't know where Rapta is, but we believe it's in that region right there that's circled. That is the Rufiji River. So outside of books and philosophers, we know that it was huge for world trade because we find Roman and Indian currencies buried all up and down the coast there. And so we know that the region connected African peoples of the central part of the continent to the rest of the world because of those Great Lakes that we talked about earlier. So, just for a little thought experiment here, say you're trying to sell some pottery on the coast of Tanzania, right? Typically, you would have to pack your pottery, your food, and your water for the trip there and the trip back. So say you want to take 5 carts or 5 things of pottery. You have to give up 2 of them for just your water and food. But if you have water and food on the way there, you can carry more product there and back. So that actually increases the amount of trade that goes through the region. So you end up with these massive super trade highways going all the way across the continent through Tanzania because they need access to the Indian Ocean, which they border. So we've got those 3 quick parts there. I need you to remember this for part 2, that being that prior to European influence, it was a very affluent part of the world, and it was very present on the world stage at the time. Now we're going to go ahead and get into the European influence part. Vasco da Gama discovered the region in 1498, and then 7 years later, the Portuguese conquered the island of Zanzibar. And then that Portuguese rule lasted until the 18th century, where indigenous people allied with Omani Arabs to overthrow their foreign rulers. The Sultan of the Omani Arabs actually moved their capital to Zanzibar, and they stayed in rule for about 40-something years until 1885 when Germans pulled up into the lagoon of Zanzibar. So you got Zanzibar here, and the lagoon is right here. So you had German gunships pull up and then point their guns at the Sultan's palace, say, hey, if you don't give us all of your lands, we're going to blow you to bits. Thankfully, we had this thing at this period in history called imperialism. I say thankfully, ironically, it was actually terrible because the British said, hey, no, Germany, you can't do that. We want some of that pie. And the French, because they were also a massive imperial power, said, no, we also want a pie. France can get a piece of the pie, but Germany and Britain broke the region of the Tanganyika Territory in two. The north went to the British and the south went to the Germans. The Germans then created what is now known as German East Africa, which was their colony state. And they began to really build up its infrastructure using railroads and things like that. So once we leave that, we then get into the world wars. There are two of them, obviously. So in World War I, the Germans lost. So they lost their claims in the Treaty of Versailles. So all of those colonies went to Britain. Britain immediately began exploiting the natural resources by taking advantage of the railroads built by the Germans to fund and build mining operations for precious metals like copper. That becomes super, super important for part two, so definitely remember that. After this, the British needed, after starting to see all the problems with their imperial spread, especially in India, they decided they needed to rely on local rule more, so they established all these local governments. Now, local government doesn't really mean what you think it means. There weren't any local peoples elected into those offices until well after World War II, where they then declared independence. We'll get to that in just a minute. And also, this is when the region was named the Tanganyika Territory. So in the World War II, Britain declares war on Germany, and they immediately arrest and imprison all the German citizens who are in the Tanganyika Territory, including in Zanzibar. Those prisoners are then later interviewed by the children's author Roald Dahl, which is a fascinating piece of history. Then after that, well, during the war, over 100,000 Tanganyikans joined Allied forces to help in the Madagascar campaign, which is the campaign that pushed Germans out of Africa, as you all know. Then we've got only a couple things left here. So in December of 1961, the Tanganyika Territory declared its independence. Following shortly after, in 1963, Zanzibar declared its independence. And in the same year, overthrew the Sultan, and then elected their first president and prime minister. Then they joined forces with the Tanganyika Territory to form modern-day Tanzania. This is in 1964. This is 80 years ago. So a lot of stuff happened in that time. I only need you to remember just the key parts, which is that you had, from the 1400s, constant European influence pressuring them and forcing them. There are all kinds of things that happened in that region. So then we've only got three things here for the post-European.
Okay. Good job.
Well, y'all can read. There you go. That's the end.
Very